Okay. Sorry.
You're here, it's fine. There you go. No relationship is without conflict, be it romantic, platonic, or professional. So arguments are bound to happen. However, oftentimes talking things out ends up being more of a cycle of miscommunication. Luckily, there are a few things that we can keep in mind to avoid miscommunication and have more productive conflict. In order to have productive arguments, it's important to be clear about what you're talking about, recognize logical fallacies, and be aware of the emotions involved. The first thing you need to do if you want to have a productive argument is to be clear about what you're talking about. In Buster Benson's Why Are We Yelling? The Art of Productive Disagreement, he describes what he calls realms of argument. This is, in my experience, I refer to it more as a framework for an argument, but it's just sort of the headspace, the way you go about looking at something. He describes 3 different realms. A realm of the head, which involves things like facts and more objective-based arguments. A realm of the heart, which involves more subjective or emotional-based, like, is this art meaningful? That really doesn't have a solid answer. And a realm of the hands, which is more practical, like, more related to, like, political policy. What would be the best way to do this? And another thing that I've learned in my own experience of having arguments is it's important to clarify your terms, the terms you're using. Language can be a little slippery sometimes. And a lot of the times we're saying the same words, but we don't actually mean the same thing. So it's important to clarify what definitions you're using and also connotations. The second important thing that you need to do if you want to have a productive argument is to be able to recognize logical fallacies. In order to recognize logical fallacies, you have to understand the construction of logic and an argument, which involves generally a premise, which is sort of the assumptions that an argument is based off of, and the conclusion, or what is drawn from those premises. A few examples of logical fallacies are the ad hominem fallacy, which involves attacking the character of the person who's making an argument rather than the argument itself. The straw man argument, which is very common in political spheres, where someone distorts the opponent's perspective and their position in order to better or easier counteract it. And thirdly, the argument from incredulity is a common one as well, where people, if they find an piece of information unbelievable, they then decide it's false. Obviously, that's not sound reasoning. Just because you don't or are unwilling to believe something doesn't mean it's not true. Lastly, when it comes to logical fallacies, it's important to know how to respond to them when you see them. The first thing you need to do is examine the argument, find the flaw in logic, and then point it out to the person you're talking to and explain why it is flawed logic. Of course, if then they double down and become hostile, then maybe this wasn't a productive argument to begin with. The last thing you need to keep in mind when having a productive argument is to be aware of the emotions involved. It's important to be aware of both your emotions and the emotions of the person you're talking to. When it comes to your emotions, it's important to recognize when certain subjects or topics or the way that things are phrased give you anxiety or make you stressed out or lead you to being defensive. It's also important to recognize the perspective that you have and how it differs from other people, to understand your biases, and to recognize that your way of viewing things isn't the only way to view things, so you can better understand the person you're talking to and their arguments to compromise. Additionally, it's important to understand the person you're talking to and their emotions, understand when things make them defensive, understand when you might be causing them stress by the way you're phrasing things, and how they might perceive the way that you say things. The way that you say things might not seem like an issue to you, but you have to understand the way that they experience them and how it looks from their perspective. The most important part of being aware of the emotions of a situation, of an argument like this, is to really know when to back out. To know when you need to leave the situation, leave the argument for another day, when you feel more calm and stable-minded. It's important to recognize when you're overwhelmed and you're not processing information well or not articulating intelligently. It's also important to recognize when a situation is escalating, when heat and tension are rising, people are raising their voices. It tends not to be a very productive argument in the end. Of course, productive argumentation has many parts between being clear about the framework and terms, being able to identify flawed logic, and being aware of the emotional aspect of the argument. But in the end, remember that conflict is an inherent part of any relationship, and it doesn't have to be the end of it. Keep in mind who you're talking to, why you care about them, and that they care about you as well, and you'll be able to come through any conflict stronger and more understanding of each other on the other side. Yay!